The moment my father opened his mouth in that courtroom, I knew exactly how this was going to end. Not because I was afraid, not because he was right about any of the things he was screaming, but because I had spent the last 2 years building the exact room he was now standing in, and he had walked into it completely blind. He didn't even notice the door close behind him. "She is delusional," he announced to the courtroom, his voice filling every corner of that wood-paneled room like he was giving a closing argument. "At the trial of the century, she has no income, no stability, no future. She lives like a ghost in some forgotten part of this city, and she has the audacity to contest this proceeding." His name was Gerald Warren. He wore a charcoal suit he'd had tailored in a different decade, when things were going better for him. He stood at the podium with the posture of a man who had never once been told he was wrong, not by a teacher, not by a business partner, not by a wife, certainly not by a daughter. That daughter was me. My name is Maya Warren. I was 31 years old. I was sitting at the defense table in a gray blazer I'd bought secondhand, and I hadn't said a single word since the hearing began. That was intentional. Judge Patricia Holt watched my father from behind her reading glasses with an expression I couldn't quite decode. Not irritation, not sympathy, something more careful than either of those things. She let him talk. She let him build momentum. She let him gesture wildly at me with an open palm like I was exhibit in a case he'd already won. "Your Honor," he said, smoothing his tie with a practiced calm that didn't match the red creeping up his neck. "My daughter has not held a verifiable position of employment in over 4 years. She refuses family assistance. She refuses professional guidance. She is, by every clinical and financial measure, incapable of managing the assets left to her by my late mother. I am asking this court to appoint a conservator. I am prepared to serve in that role myself." He glanced back at me then, just a flicker, looking for the flinch. I was counting the light fixtures. There were 11. Gerald turned back to the judge, satisfied that my silence confirmed everything he'd just said. His attorney, a compact man named Douglas Frett who smelled faintly of cigarettes and ambition, shuffled papers beside him without looking up. He'd barely spoken since the hearing began either, but for very different reasons than mine. Douglas Frett had seen the documents the bailiff delivered 20 minutes ago. He was still processing them. "Miss Warren," Judge Holt said, finally turning to me, "you've chosen to represent yourself today. Is that still your preference?" "It is, Your Honor." My voice came out even, not defiant, not trembling, just there like a fact. Gerald exhaled audibly. He turned to Douglas and muttered something behind his hand. I didn't need to hear it. I'd been listening to variations of that exhale my entire life. The one that said, "There she goes again, embarrassing everyone. Let me tell you about Gerald Warren, because understanding him is the only way any of what comes next makes sense. He was brilliant once, genuinely. A self-made man who built a mid-size financial consulting firm from 2 clients and a shared office space. In his late 20s, he had a gift for reading rooms, for knowing what people wanted to hear and delivering it with just enough authority that they believed it was the truth. He was charming. He was driven. And for about 15 years, he was successful enough that nobody looked too closely at the seams. My mother left when I was 9, not because she stopped loving him, I think, but because she finally looked at the seams. After she left, I became the project. The thing Gerald poured his frustration into when the firm had a bad quarter, when a client walked, when a deal collapsed. I was the repository for everything that hadn't gone right. The report card that wasn't perfect enough. The college that wasn't prestigious enough. The career path that wasn't legible enough to display at dinner parties. When I told him at 26 that I was leaving my corporate job to work independently, he laughed for a long time. Then he stopped laughing and said something I never forgot. "You're throwing your life away to prove a point to nobody." I didn't argue. I just started building. The thing about being underestimated for 31 years is that you stop announcing yourself. You stop explaining. You stop asking for approval you were never going to receive anyway. You develop a different relationship with silence. You understand that silence is not weakness. Silence is information management. Silence is strategic. Silence is how you let someone walk confidently into a room they don't realize you designed. Gerald was still talking. "She has no husband, no partner, no children, no property in her name. She drives a car with a broken side mirror that she has apparently never bothered to repair. This is not the profile of a person capable of managing a multi-generational estate. This is the profile of someone who needs intervention before they do real damage." Judge Holt made a note. Gerald took that as encouragement. "My mother, God rest her, loved Maya. She was generous to a fault, but she was also unwell in her final years, and I believe she was manipulated into including specific provisions in her estate that do not reflect her true intentions. I am not here to contest the will. I am here to protect the assets within it from being mismanaged by someone who, with respect, has never demonstrated any capacity for financial responsibility." He sat down. He actually looked satisfied. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Douglas Fret leaned over and whispered something urgent into Gerald's ear. Gerald waved him off the way. You wave off a fly that keeps returning to the same spot. His jaw was set. His posture was victorious. He genuinely believed that what he'd just said was enough. That the picture he'd painted, the broken mirror, the absent husband, the ghost life in some forgotten neighborhood, would be sufficient to convince a judge to hand him control of an estate he had been trying to access for 2 years. He didn't ask what was in the documents the bailiff had delivered. That was his final mistake. Judge Holt set down her pen. She looked at the papers in front of her for a long moment. Then she looked up at Gerald with an expression I can only describe as the look a person gives when they already know the punchline and they're watching someone else get close to it. Mr. Warren, she said quietly, you've described your daughter as someone with no assets, no verifiable income, and no demonstrated financial acumen. Is that an accurate summary of your position? It is, Gerald said firmly, and you're asking this court to appoint you as conservator of the estate left by your mother Elaine Warren, valued at approximately $400,000, because you believe your daughter is incapable of managing it responsibly. Correct? Judge Holt nodded slowly. Then she held up a single document. She didn't read from it yet. She just held it there between 2 fingers. The way you hold something you want someone to really see. Tell me something, she said, and her voice was so quiet the entire room leaned forward. Before you filed this petition, did you conduct any independent research into your daughter's financial history? Gerald's chin lifted slightly. I have known my daughter her entire life. Your Honor, I don't believe additional research was necessary. Judge Holt looked at him for a long moment. You really don't know who she is, she said. It wasn't a question. Gerald blinked. His attorney went completely still beside him. The papers in Douglas Fret's hands stopped moving. He had read the documents. He understood exactly what was about to happen. He had been trying to stop this train for 20 minutes, and the train did not stop. Gerald turned to look at me. It was the first time that morning that he really looked at me, not at the broken mirror, or the second-hand blazer, or the quiet hands folded in my lap. He looked at my face, and something shifted in his expression, something small and uneasy, like a floor that had been solid a moment ago, and had just moved beneath his feet. I looked back at him calmly. The room was very still, and Judge Holt began to read. What she read changed the color in my father's face from the triumphant red of a man who had already won to something closer to ash. Douglas Fret closed his eyes. The court reporter's finger slowed. Someone in the gallery drew a sharp breath. Gerald opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because the woman he had just described to a federal judge as a drifter, with no assets and no future had, over the past 4 years, done something he hadn't thought to check for, something he would have found immediately if he hadn't been so certain that his version of me was the only version that existed. She had built something, and it was much larger than he had ever imagined. The change wasn't announced. It revealed itself in patterns, a routine that slowly shifted, a schedule that no longer matched previous promises. At first, it felt temporary, a phase that would pass on its own, but the adjustments kept repeating. Consistency turned into unpredictability. Unpredictability created distance. Distance created questions. Those questions stayed mostly unspoken. Instead, observation took over. Every interaction was quietly evaluated. Every response carried extra weight. Trust didn't collapse overnight. It adapted into something cautious. Confidence was replaced with careful attention. Careful attention uncovered contradictions. Contradictions reshaped expectations. And expectations, once altered, changed everything that followed. Judge Holt read the numbers slowly. Not because she needed to. She had clearly reviewed the documents before the hearing began. She read them slowly because she understood, the way experienced judges often do, that certain truths need time to land. That some revelations, if delivered too quickly, allow people to deflect, to deny, to reframe. She wanted Gerald Warren to hear every single word. Cascade Financial Consulting Group, she said, setting the first page flat on the desk. Registered LLC, sole managing member, Maya Elaine Warren. Annual revenue for the most recent fiscal year, $1.2 million. Gerald's head turned toward me with the slow, mechanical quality of something that had just stopped working correctly. Judge Holt continued. Holdings, Maya Elaine Warren. Current portfolio for residential buildings. 1 mixed-use commercial property. She paused, including the building at 1140 Fontaine Avenue. Is that address familiar to you, Mr. Warren? The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. 1140 Fontaine Avenue was where my father's firm had operated for 6 years. It was where he held his client meetings, where he kept the framed magazine profile from 2009, hanging in the reception area, where he had spent the better part of a decade performing the role of a man who had everything figured out. He paid rent there every month like clockwork. He had never once looked up the ownership records. That's not possible, he said. His voice had changed. The courtroom authority was gone. What was left underneath it was thin and confused. I pay rent to a management company. I've never dealt with her. I've never. You've been paying rent to a management company she owns, Judge Holt said simply. For 3 years. Douglas Fred had both hands flat on the table. He was staring at a point somewhere in the middle distance. The expression of a man who had done the math and arrived at a number he did not enjoy. Gerald looked at me again. I held his gaze. I didn't smile. I wasn't angry. I was something harder to define. Something that lives on the far side of years of quiet work and patience. I was just present. Fully and completely present in a room I had been building toward for a very long time. Let me tell you what he didn't know. After my grandmother's health began to decline 3 years ago, Gerald had started making visits he'd never bothered to make before. Suddenly he was attentive. Suddenly he was concerned. He drove 2 hours every other weekend to sit with her, to review her finances with her, to gently suggest that her estate planning could be more streamlined, more protected, better managed by someone with real financial expertise. He meant himself. My grandmother, Elaine Warren, was sharp until nearly the end. She had watched Gerald her entire adult life. She had watched him charm and maneuver and position himself. She loved him because he was her son, and that love was real, but she was not confused about who he was. She called me 8 months before she passed. It was early on a Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of reviewing a client proposal and almost didn't pick up. I need you to listen carefully, she said, because I'm only going to say this once. She told me about his visits. She told me about the suggestions he'd been making, the documents he'd quietly slid across her kitchen table, the names of attorneys he'd recommended she speak with. She told me she hadn't signed anything, but she was worried about what happened after she was gone, when she wouldn't be there to say no. I'm leaving you what I'm leaving you, she said, not because you need it. I know you don't need it, baby. I've been watching you. I know exactly what you've built. There was a long pause. I'm leaving it to you because he will come for it. And when he does, I need you to be ready. I didn't tell her how ready I already was. What I had built over for years was not glamorous from the outside. That was intentional. The car with the broken mirror was real. I drove it because I didn't care about the mirror. The second-hand clothes were real. I wore them because I spent my energy on things that compounded, not things that depreciated. The apartment in a quiet, overlooked building was real. I lived there because the building was mine, and I preferred the corner unit with the good light and the view of the water. I was not performing poverty. I was simply not performing wealth. There's a difference, and it's a difference that takes most people a long time to understand. Gerald had spent his career in rooms full of people performing wealth. He had learned to read those performances. He knew the signals, the watches, the tailoring, the name of the right restaurant, the right car, the right conference. He had built his entire understanding of power on those signals. And because I didn't send them, because I showed up to family dinners in quiet, close and deflected questions about my work with short answers, he had simply written a version of me and stopped looking. He had not looked. That was his architecture, and I had known it for years. Judge Holt set down the final document. Mr. Warren, she said, the petition before this court asks me to appoint a conservator on the grounds that your daughter lacks the capacity to manage inherited assets responsibly. She folded her hands. Having reviewed the financial disclosures submitted this morning, I find no evidentiary basis for that claim. In fact, what I find is essentially the opposite. Gerald's jaw tightened. Furthermore, she continued, and her voice took on a quality that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. I want to address the characterization you offered of your daughter's living situation, professional history, and personal stability. You made those statements under oath. You made them with considerable confidence, and they were in every material respect incorrect. She let that sit for a moment. Courts take that seriously. Douglas Fred stood up. Your Honor, my client was operating on incomplete information. There was no intent to. Mr. Fred, the judge said quietly. Sit down. He sat down. Gerald was very still now. The posturing was gone. The crimson had faded. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like his actual age. Like someone who had walked a long distance and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. Judge Holt turned to me. Ms. Warren, do you wish to make a statement before I issue my ruling? I had prepared for this moment. I had a folder with me. I could have walked the court through every property, every contract, every carefully structured entity. I could have laid it all out systematically and watched his face process each layer. There was a version of this where I performed my victory the way he had performed his certainty. I didn't do that. No, Your Honor, I said. I think the record speaks for itself. She looked at me for a moment, then she nodded, just slightly. The ruling took 4 minutes to deliver. The petition was denied with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. My grandmother's estate would transfer to me as written. Gerald was ordered to cover court costs. Judge Holt also made a formal notation in the record regarding the accuracy of statements made under oath, a notation that would not disappear. Gerald didn't move when she finished. Douglas Frett packed his bag quietly and left without looking at his client. I had watched attorneys do that before. The professional retreat. The careful distance they put between themselves and a situation that had gone irreversibly wrong. There was no drama in it, just a man picking up a briefcase and walking toward a door. I gathered my own papers slowly. There was no rush. Gerald was still seated when I stood. He was looking at the table in front of him, not at me, not at the judge, just at the polished wood surface. The way you look at something when your mind has gone somewhere else entirely and your eyes haven't gotten the message yet. I paused beside him on my way out. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stood there until he looked up. His face was different, not broken, not exactly, more like rearranged. The architecture of his confidence had held for so long that its absence left something unfamiliar behind. He looked like a man who had just realized that the story he'd been telling about his life had a different narrator than he thought. I'm not going to say anything cruel, I told him. My voice was low enough that only he could hear it, because I don't need to, and because she wouldn't have wanted me to. He understood who I meant. His throat moved. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. My heels were quiet on the hardwood. Outside in the corridor, the afternoon light came through tall windows in long, clean angles. A clerk nodded at me as I passed. Someone's phone buzzed on a bench. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. I had spent for years building something in silence. Not to prove a point, not to win a room, but because the work itself was the answer to everything he had ever said about me. Every dismissal, every exhale, every laugh across a dinner table. The work was the answer, and the work was done. I walked out into the open air, and for the first time in a very long time, the quiet felt like mine. When everything settled, what remained wasn't anger. It wasn't victory either. It was clarity. Clarity about what had been ignored. Clarity about what had been assumed. And clarity about what could no longer continue the same way. There was no final speech, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet recognition that things had changed. Some relationships don't break loudly. They shift, they redefine themselves. They force reflection instead of reaction. Looking back, the signs had always been there, not obvious but present, and once seen, they couldn't be unseen. Growth rarely feels comfortable. Understanding rarely feels immediate, but both leave a mark that lasts longer than emotion. In the end, the story didn't close with noise. It closed with awareness. And sometimes, awareness is the most powerful ending of all.